Thank you all for being present. I can't see most of you, but it's nice to know that you're there. What I will be doing today, during my talk, I'm going to show a PowerPoint so that you don't have to just look at my face. And also because it's connected to the lecture, which will be about the book Tales from the Borderlands and other topics. So I'm just going to share this. One sec. I believe everybody can see that. So we'll start. In the summer of 1995, I interviewed my mother for the first, and as it turned out, the last time about her childhood. She told me about growing up in her hometown of Buchach, near interwar Poland's border with the Soviet Union, on the eastern rim of what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire's province of Galicia. At the time, I knew very little about that world, from which my mother came as an 11-year-old to Palestine in 1935, just a few years before it was utterly destroyed. I was only vaguely aware that none of my family who stayed behind had emerged from the maelstrom of World War II and the Holocaust. That 90-minute conversation, which I construct and elaborate in the last 3 chapters of the book that Jean-Marc just kindly mentioned, Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past, set me off on a decades-long journey. My first goal was to write a micro-history of the Holocaust in one typical East European town. The second was to reconstruct the inner world of the peoples who populated the borderlands province of Galicia in the centuries prior to its destruction. Eastern Europe was where most European Jews had lived before the war and where most of them were murdered. That early interview with my mother also alerted me to the fact that the genocide of the Jews was not only a German project targeting a specific population for murder, but also a social event which took place in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious environment where Jews had lived side by side with Christian neighbors for centuries. In conceiving the methodology of what eventually became the earlier book, 2018, published in 2018, Anatomy of a Genocide, I therefore thought of it as a biography of a town. My working title for many years for this book was The Voice of Your Brother's Blood. Then the publisher persuaded me to change the title. This term, the voice of your brother's blood, alludes to God's question to Cain after he slays Abel. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Thus, the book tries to narrate the events in this town of approximately 15,000 people, half of whom were Jews, the other half Poles and Ukrainians, through the voices of its inhabitants. As it zeroes in on the implementation of mass murder, the book uses hundreds of diaries, letters, testimonies, judicial eyewitness accounts, interviews, and memoirs by victims, bystanders, and perpetrators to create a 3-dimensional picture of what genocide looks like in one locality through the eyes of those who were there. Perhaps the most important finding from this reconstruction of local genocide, and I'll have much more to say about that book tomorrow, is its intimacy. By the time the killing began in earnest, A year into the German occupation, many of the protagonists had gotten to know each other, often by name. The conventional view of the Holocaust as an industrial undertaking facilitating distance, compartmentalization, and dehumanization is belied by events in Buchach and hundreds of similar towns across the vast swath of Europe's eastern borderlands, stretching from the Baltic to the Balkans. While the perpetrators and their local helpers knew the victims, the rest of the population also engaged with the genocidal process, whether by denouncing or, less often, hiding Jews, and generally profiting materially from their disappearance. Over time, and under different regimes, people's roles often changed, with real or perceived victims becoming perpetrators, and vice versa. On the local level, then, the Holocaust often appeared like a bloody family feud or a neighborhood civil war. Outside forces at times triggered or enhanced the dimensions of the killing. At other times, as during the ethnic cleansing of Poles by Ukrainian nationalists, they simply stood by. By 1947, following the establishment of Soviet rule in this region, the process of unmixing populations was completed by way of a vast Polish-Ukrainian population exchange with Poland. The former multi-ethnic Galicia was thus transformed into an ethnically homogeneous West Ukraine, as it remains to this day. The borderlands, the region that the late Eric Weitz and I called the shatter zone of empires in a volume we co-edited, which had already disappeared from political maps in 1918, now also receded from memory. It is the story of that long-vanished world, which in its last decades gave birth to the modern era of nationalism and violence, that I've tried to tell in Tales from the Borderlands. Unlike Anatomy of a Genocide, which focuses on the origins and reality of local mass murder, here I wanted to reconstruct the borderlands in its own right, rather than as a stepping stone toward destruction. I also wanted to further explore the idea of writing a history of a place and a region through the voices of its people. In writing about the genocide in Buchach, I employed hundreds of first-person accounts. But telling the story of the borderlands before its destruction entailed resorting to the tales the region told about itself, its myths and legends, its fiction and poetry, as well as the biographies and memoirs of its inhabitants. In other words, what I sought to do was to write the history of Galicia, with Buchach at its heart, as a first-person history of a place and a time. First-person histories do not tell us everything about a place or a person, but they can provide us with a glimpse into how people narrated their lives and times and understood, remembered, and tried to represent the world. The book is therefore less of a history from below, about the ordinary people who inhabited the place, or a local history of a particular site, but rather a history from within, in that it strives to perceive a forgotten world through the prism of its self-representation and the biographies of some of its inhabitants. In this manner, I believe, we discover some of that world's strangeness and familiarity, hopes and disillusionments, and ultimately grasp its transformation into our own reality and what we have lost in the process. Tales from the Borderlands is structured around three temporal and spatial questions. Where did we come from? What did we become? And where did we go? It concludes with a section dedicated to my mother's transition to Palestine, titled The Last Journey. I begin with the region's conflicting tales of origins. 19th century Polish accounts of early modern territorial expansion into what is now called Ukraine are filled with heroic figures, sweeping landscapes, dramatic battles, intrigue and passion, sacrifice and love. The borderlands, or the Kresy, as it's known in Polish, have lodged themselves deeply in the Polish romantic imagination, with the wild lands of the eastern steppe playing a role somewhat akin to that of the Wild West in American myth and lore. Indeed, when the Polish author and Nobel laureate Henryk Sienkiewicz wrote his 1884 historical novel With Fire and Sword on the 17th century Cossack uprising, he traveled to the American West for inspiration. The earliest chronicler of Buchach, Friar Sadok Baranch, a Polish Dominican of Armenian origins, published his colorful account in 1882. Reflecting the sentiments of a strong defender of Roman Catholic faith and the Polish nation, it is also a rich source of local myths and anecdotes. For Baranch, who spent his entire life in Galicia, the story begins with the original owners of the city, the noble Buchacki clan, for obvious reasons. It was the Buchackis, he writes, who as early as the 16th century, quote, defended Ruthenia. Ruthenia is the old name of what we now know as Ukraine, defended Ruthenia and Galicia with their own bodies against the invasion of the wild oppressors, for this was the root of the Tartars. They were like shepherds protecting their flocks from hungry wolves, end of quote. Fledgling Ukrainian nationalism saw things in a very different light, presenting Ukrainians as the indigenous inhabitants of the land. In 1881, a broadsheet by the revolutionary organization Narodnia Volia appealed to the masses to join the pogroms in Russian-ruled Ukraine and rid themselves of foreign oppression. Things were different in, quote, in the days of our forefathers, it proclaimed, and I'm quoting, the peasants owned all the land. There were no Polish lords or Jews. The people were free Cossacks. Until the Russian Tsars came to Ukraine, and this cheerful country was shrouded in sorrow. They deprived the people of all the land, handing parts of it to the Polish lords and selling part of it to the Kaiks, while handing the freemen to them as slaves. End of quote. Writing a century later in his Canadian exile, the Ukrainian historian of Buchach, Yosif Kladochny, stressed the Polish takeover of Ukrainian lands. He wrote, the Poles wanted to Polonize the native population with the assistance of Catholicism in its Roman form, and to pressure the Ukrainian nobility into supporting the Latin Rite. Because Ukrainian nobles were not allowed into state offices and their properties were confiscated, they accepted the Latin Rite and their clans became Polish. End of quote. The Jews, for their part, told a very different tale of origins. The author Shmuel Yosef Agnon, born in Buchach in 1887, and the only Hebrew language Nobel Prize laureate, left Buchach as a young man in 1908 and died in Jerusalem in 1970. His vast book, A City in Its Fullness, Ir Umloa in Hebrew, published 3 years after his death, can be described as a biography of Buchach, which he viewed as representative of the lost world of East European Jewish civilization. In Agnon's version, it was a caravan of Jews traveling from their homes in the Rhineland to the Holy Land who founded the city. Heading east in the presumed direction of the land of Israel, the Jews eventually reach a region of, quote, boundless forest with birds and animals and beasts, where the local noblemen invited them to shelter in their homes over the harsh winter. Because those noblemen had taken the Jews into their homes, and those noblemen who took Jews into their homes enjoyed prosperity in everything they did, he writes, they began to urge them to stay with them, saying, the whole land is at your disposal, and if you want to engage in commerce in the land, better still, for no one here knows anything about trade. And so, concludes Agnon, the Jews, quote, dwelled there for several generations in peace and tranquility, except in years of war and revolution, until the enemy came. The enemy is his name for the Nazis, and eradicated them all. For several centuries, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews lived side by side in that region, developing a common way of life made up of distinct, but not necessarily antagonistic cultures. Today, Buchach, like many other towns in Europe's eastern borderlands, bears the marks and scars of the modern era. The city's most attractive edifices, erected in the 18th century, stand out in a largely dilapidated urban landscape that has witnessed the effects of 2 world wars and the rule of corrupt, ineffective, and at times outright murderous regimes. The most famous remaining edifice in Buchach is the city hall, Ratush or Ratusha, or Stadtrat, whose story and legends illustrate how different groups and ideologies interpreted it to conform to their own needs. Commissioned by the lord of the city, Mikołaj Potocki, and completed in 1751, the city hall is the joint creation of the celebrated architect Bernard Meretten and sculptor Johann Georg Pinsel, who carved for it 16 sculptures, including allegorical representations of the 12 labors of Hercules. Topped by a 115-foot tower, this Rococo edifice is described by one Ukrainian art critic as, quote, unparalleled in 18th century architecture, because its architecture and sculptures are combined so harmoniously that one cannot imagine the city without the statues, the city hall without the statues. Most of the sculptures have unfortunately disappeared over the years. The author Agnon, however, as the self-appointed chronicler of Jewish Buchach, has a very different story to tell. For him, it is necessary to explain why the pious Jewish community of his birth had developed such admiration for the array of barely clothed, heroic stone figures overlooking the very marketplace where most Jews lived and traded. Agnon, the storyteller, resolves this conundrum by reimagining the city hall maker as a crypto-Jew named Theodore. The many stone sculptures he built, writes Agnon, had, quote, the faces of the Jews, whom Theodore saw in the town of Buchach, and of those Jews that he saw in his nightly dreams and visions, end of quote. But why did Theodore dream of Jews? As Agnon writes, quote, and this is a lengthy quote from his description, one evening, Theodore went for a walk in the town. He came upon the Jewish street, where he saw a house lit up with many candles and filled with people, wearing white and holding books. And one man was standing among them, and his voice was like the voice of a man praying for his soul. Theodore did not know whether he actually saw this or it was a dream. Yet what he saw was not a dream, but reality, which he had already seen as a child. For when he was a boy, his mother took him to a house full of candles, and there were many people there, all wearing white. The boy sat at his mother's feet and slept. His sister took him home, and a group of people dressed all in black came toward them and took him out of his sister's arms and brought him to the man who built houses and made sculptures, and the man called him Theodore after himself. Theodore grew, and his name became one of the great craftsmen who built halls and made sculptures. The Lord of Buchach, Mikołaj Potocki, heard of Theodore's fame and brought him to his town. And he built for him the city hall, and he adorned it with beautiful images in the likeness of the men and women that Theodore had seen in the town and that he had seen in his dreams. But in Agnon's tale, Theodore becomes a victim of his own genius. Once his work is completed, Potocki imprisons him in the tower, afraid that he would produce a masterpiece for another city. In desperation, Theodore makes for himself wings from the leftover building materials. Jumping from the tower, writes Agnon, he flew across the Stripa, that's the stream that dissects the town. But then he fell down and died. In death, he gave his name, Fedor in Polish and Fedir in Ukrainian, to the hill upon which he crashed. The same hill, notes Agnon, where the Jews of Buchach were murdered 200 years later by the Nazis. This fable has made the rounds through different generations and national ideological configurations. Ihor Duda, who authored, he's a Ukrainian writer, who authored a tourist guide to Buchach published in Lviv in 1985, relates for his part that the city hall was built by 3 local Ukrainian men, all, quote, skillful craftsmen. They too tried to fly from the tower where Potocki had imprisoned them, and the youngest, quote, Fedir, landed on the hill that was then named after him. Writing just before the fall of the communist regime in 1991 in Ukraine, Duda also adds a Soviet twist to the story, noting that in 1953, workers, quote, discovered fragments of an airplane near the hill. The Red Air Force pilot, as it turned out, was also named Fedir. Hence, assures us Duda, quote, the ancient name of the hill had acquired a new meaning. What he neglects to tell his readers is that in October 1944, members of the Soviet Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes found the remains of 7,500 Jewish inhabitants of the town and the district in shallow mass graves on the Federal Hill and the nearby Cemetery Hill. There is a stark contrast between such splendid esoteric tales, legends, parables, and myths reflected in this story and many, many others which I cannot relate here, and the sordid reality of mass murder that put an end to the civilization that produced them. This contrast tells us a great deal about how the identity of the people who came to the borderlands was shaped and transformed over time. Since World War II, when the floor of the forest begins to thaw, fragments of bones occasionally resurface from the mass graves on Federal Hill. Other fragments of the pre-war past also emerge every so often from oblivion. In 2008, the well-preserved statue of the Virgin Mary was discovered and has since been restored and returned to its pedestal on a column in the city designed by Pinsel and Meretten. Nowadays, the Holy Mother is once more watching over Buchach. Where did the people of the borderlands go? One paradox of the years between the revolution of 1848 and the outbreak of World War I is that many Europeans experienced them both as a time of unprecedented new opportunities for self-realization and collective liberation, and also as a period of growing national constraints on individual and collective identities. Those living in such remote borderland towns as Buchach could now more easily escape the fetters of traditional society, travel across the continent, and transform themselves in ways unimaginable to their ancestors. But as groups and individuals began identifying themselves nationally and ideologically, they also increasingly distinguished others by whether history gave them the right to live where they dwelt and in the manner they chose. Nationalism thus narrowed the range of individual opportunities and closed people within an ethno-national context and redefined neighbors as outsiders with no rights of belonging. In this manner, personal liberation could be redefined as collective fate, and future aspirations were perceived through the prism of traumatic pasts. In a celebrated novel, A Guest for the Night, published on the eve of World War II and occasioned by the author's visit to Buchach in 1930, Agnon contemplates the hopes and disillusionments of those who left the borderlands for the brave new world of the 20th century. As the unnamed protagonist returns to his hometown of Shibush, that's the name that he gives to Buchach, the literary name, which means in Hebrew, something gone wrong, signs of devastation, depopulation, and impoverishment caused by the previous war are everywhere. There, the protagonist encounters an old childhood friend, and they take an evening stroll in the streets of the city. The friend is called Aharon Schützling, who bears an uncanny resemblance to a historical son of the city, a man called Max Nacht, who spent his youth roaming through Europe as an anarchist activist, emigrated to the United States on the eve of World War I, and subsequently gained a certain reputation in leftist circles under his new name, Max Nomad. Both the narrator and Schützling have been away from their hometown for many years and are keenly aware of how profoundly both the city and their own outlooks have changed over time. We were about 16 or 17, recalls Agnon's protagonist, and although we differed in our opinions, for I was a Zionist and he an anarchist, we were glad to talk to each other. Neither man's hopes have been realized. At the time, the narrator remembers, Schützling would often tease me and call me a bourgeois of the next world, that is, of the afterlife, because I studied the Torah and preached for Zion. And I would enrage him by conceding some of his arguments and saying that there is no need for kings, since the King Messiah is destined to reign over the entire world. So many years have passed since that time. So many kings have toppled from their thrones, and still the Son of David has not come. End of quote. The two men are now exiles who can never find what they were looking for in their new home, yet can never return to the home they had left behind. This was all the more dispiriting for those who returned to their homes following the devastation of World War I, let alone those few Holocaust survivors coming back to their former homes and finding them inhabited by neighbors or strangers who saw them as threatening their newly found ownership and as a reminder of a crime for which few were punished. The two friends decide to have a drink together and mull over their respective exiles and their temporary return to their common hometown. Growing increasingly melancholic and drinking heavily, Schützling records his first love and mother. I'm sorry, this shouldn't be here. It jumped. Sorry. Schützling records his first love and the mother of his firstborn. Do you remember the song the charming brunette used to sing? He asked the narrator. Let's drink to her memory and sing her song. My years have passed in pain and wrath. I've known no joy or blessing. I spent my days in futile grief. Sleep now, my baby. The despair and melancholia expressed by Agnon's character Schützling, the man without a home, was reflected in the later writings of his alter ego Max Nacht, by then known as Max Nomad. In a book he published in 1953 under the title A Skeptic's Political Dictionary and Handbook for the Disenchanted, Nomad described himself as, quote, a socialist in my high school days, an anarchist as a college student, a syndicalist sui generis during the years of my romantic and not so romantic vagabondage, and finally a Soviet sympathizer some 40 years ago when Lenin and Trotsky were still glorious legends between 1917 and 1920. He had seen plenty of the world that emerged with the disappearance of the borderlands and the rise of nationalism, communism, and fascism. By 1964, at the age of 83, his view of humanity was bleaker than ever. By then, Nomad no longer believed that, quote, the masses can be redeemed. And if he still supported, quote, the greatest possible extension of the welfare state, it was only because this alone can prevent totalitarian demagogues of any hue to seize power by pandering to the resentments of the hungry and therefore bloodthirsty mob of unemployed or underpaid manual or white-collar workers. Nomad, formerly Nacht, was writing in the United States, where he had spent most of his life. But in 1930, he made a trip to Europe, where he might have in fact met Agnon in Buchach, under the literary name of Schützling. Yet although he and Agnon had left Europe behind, others stayed or were left behind. One of them, as it turned out, was that charming brunette that Schützling recalled during his encounter with Agnon's protagonist. I came by the skeleton in Nomad's closet quite by chance in March 2010, when I received a letter from a certain Dr. Alain Canfer, a retired French physician in Paris. The history of Buchach touches me personally, he wrote. My grandmother, on my father's side, named Sarah, also known as Sabina Canfer, was born in Buchach in 1880. She left Buchach in 1911 and arrived in Paris in August 1912, pregnant and unmarried. She lived in Paris, where she worked as a teacher of Polish until her death in 1936. She converted to Catholicism in 1931. My father, Julien, was born in March 1913. Apparently, my grandmother never said a word about my grandfather, who remained entirely unknown. My father married my non-Jewish mother in 1939, and I was born in November 1940 and was raised entirely by my maternal grandparents after my mother died in 42, and my father joined the Resistance in 1943. That December, I met Dr. Camfer in Paris, at which point I realized that he was Max Nacht's grandson. As it turned out, Sarah left Buchach much earlier than Alain thought, and married Max Nacht in 1908. By 1910, the couple seems to have been living in Paris. The following year, they moved to Rome. But in 1912, after participating in a general strike, Max fled to Constantinople, Istanbul, while Sabina returned to Paris, pregnant with his baby. Since Max immigrated to the United States shortly thereafter, they may have never met again, and there is no record of him ever mentioning her in his voluminous writings. But perhaps they did meet after all. In his encounter with Agnon's narrator in A Guest for the Night, Max Nacht, nomad, in the person of Schützling, comments that the same charming brunette he had left with his child forgave me before her death. Sabina died in 1936, when Agnon was still writing his novel. But Max's son Julien, the future resistance fighter, apparently never found out his father's identity, and if he did, he never told his son, the Parisian physician, who finally discovered it only after his retirement. It was only then that Dr. Camfer figured out that his great-grandfather was the longtime director of the Buchach Hospital, Dr. Fabius Nacht, Max's father. His grandmother, Sabina, for her part, was the daughter of Mordechai Camfer, or Marcus, one of Agnon's influential teachers in Buchach. That her brother Moshe, through whom she met Max, was later known in Krakow as the celebrated literary figure Mojżesz Camfer, who was involved in Yiddish theater in the interwar period, eventually murdered by the Nazis with a similarly well-known wife, Gisela. Their surviving daughter, Irena, later known as Irene Camfer, became an important poet and translator of Yiddish poetry in France, whom Dr. Alain Camfer had met only once as a youth without ever knowing that she was in fact his cousin. Irene Camfer was born in 1920, just 4 years before my mother. When I asked my mother in 1995 what she knew about our family's history in Galicia, she said, "I just know about grandfather on father's side and grandfather on mother's side," she said. "But I don't know any. And my father didn't tell." Sorry. So I asked her, were there any stories about the family from before? "Maybe there were," she said, "but I don't know any. And my father didn't tell me. He didn't talk about before. What I know," she said, "is that during World War I, when my mother herself was still a girl, we were refugees in Czechoslovakia, and her brother studied music there. He had a violin, and sometimes, on family occasions, he would play. Shimon, she said, recalling his name. I realized then, as I realize now, how late I was in setting out on this inquiry about my family. The people who could remember beyond my mother's memory, such as my grandparents, all born around 1900 and themselves possessing memories of family stories dating far back into the 19th century, were all gone. My mother remembered only fragments of that past. With the sole exception of one document, confirmation of my grandfather's certificate for immigration to Palestine, my family seems to have left no traces in the archives. The few remaining family photographs largely contain people whose names and relationships to each other I will never know. Some are inscribed and dated on the back, but the moment to tap into the memories of those who knew the people in the photos, and in most cases mourned their murder long thereafter, has passed. What I vividly remember and loved very much, my mother said, was when we went in the summer to grandfather in Koshmiezhin, the village where she was born. We used to go to the forest and pick wild berries, and would go to bathe in the Dniester. It appeared to me huge at the time. The other bank looked so far. They would also visit her mother's village, Rozhnov, on the banks of the Cheremosh, which at the time demarcated the border between Poland and Romania. We would go down to the river and catch fish with a bottle. For lunch, they ate mamaliga. On mother's side, she said, the uncle who lived in Rozhnov had two daughters. The uncle in Kosov, a nearby Carpathian town, was childless. I asked my mother whether after coming to Palestine she missed Buchach. I missed it very much, she said, because suddenly I didn't know the language or anyone there. There were no grandparents or grandmothers. In school, I looked for those who were like me. I had a girlfriend who came with us together on the same ship. We were attached to each other because of that feeling of being different. But then, she added, I cut myself off completely from those memories, totally cut off. Perhaps there was a strong urge to enter into this world because it was clear we'd never again see the world we came from. It was a hard life in Palestine. Her parents would leave to work in the dark and return in the dark because they had to go on foot. And we, she said, as children, grew up on our own. She cared for her two younger brothers. At age 12, I was already a homemaker. I don't remember ever having time to play or that I went anywhere to have fun. She distinctly recalled the high holidays in 1939, a couple of weeks after the war began, when in the synagogue, quote, everyone was crying and covering themselves with their prayer shawls. There was real weeping and lamentation. But no one could imagine what would happen, end of quote. In fact, she commented, quote, no members of the family survive, end of quote. Did they ever find what happened? I asked her. So that's it, she said. Nothing was found out. Someone told Mother that her brother, the violinist, was caught and shot during the roundups, and that his wife had two daughters. And that his wife and two daughters were shot even earlier in Kosovo. As for Father's only sister, who was, so to speak, the jewel in the crown, because she had married a man with an academic education, they escaped to Koshmiezhin, to their village, and hid there. They had one son. The Gentile, hiding them, demanded that she get rid of the child, because the child cries and would give them away. But she refused, and apparently they denounced her, and that's how they perished. So that is all I know about what happened to those members of my family who stayed behind. They literally disappeared without a trace. I had spent years, 20 years, recreating the life and death of Buchach, going through thousands of documents and hundreds of testimonies. But my family had been erased from the historical record, and there was nothing I could do about it. Over the years, I also became increasingly aware that even if, like so many others across several generations, I did not know how my own family had been murdered, that unrecorded event nevertheless seeped from one generation to another, an unspoken, inexpressible act of violence that altered and damaged our psyches. It has appeared to me necessary to render a measure of justice to those who had been killed by imagining their lives and deaths rather than simply noting that they had occurred. I also came to believe that the long-term ramifications of this violence, the trauma that infected children and grandchildren, could be mitigated by returning to the scene of the crime. So that is what I've tried to do in my recent novel, The Butterfly and the Axe, to provide those erased from the historical record with a credible, albeit imagined, life story set within the contours of history. This book is an attempt to fill the gaps that the documentary history has left us to grapple with in ways that respect and conform to information we have, yet transgress the limits of scholarship. It does so by presenting a series of characters who never existed but could have, by linking actual historical figures to imaginary ones, and by constructing the lives and deaths of actual people in a manner that cannot be supported by documents, but emanates from the little that we do know about them, from fragments of stories, rumors, and memories. Because we can never return to the past, and because the past is always experienced and remembered differently by those who populated it, I try to tell the story through the perspective of real and imaginary characters. As a result, when we eventually discover what actually happened, we are left to speculate whether that is the whole truth. The historical truth, I believe, necessarily lies somewhere in between, never quite resolved, and always disputed. In this particular journey into the past, I depict how one violent event, the murder of a family in the remote Ukrainian village of Koshmiezhin in the spring of 1944, the village where my mother was born, and of which she had sweet childhood memories, and where her aunt, the jewel in the crown, was murdered along with her family, determined the fate of two families, one Ukrainian and one Jewish, in ways that could not easily be understood by later generations. And I try to imagine, partly through my own travels through those regions, how that painful journey into the past, the obsession with finding out what happened, can bring about a modicum of peace and reconciliation. In straddling history and fiction, I acknowledge that historical study, as we know it, cannot do sufficient justice to those who vanished without a trace. They need to be brought back so as to make history whole. Still, every letter, diary, and testimony I reproduce in the novel closely follows a historical source. In that sense, I want readers to wonder what is real and what is fiction, and to help them enter a world that was once as real as our own, though it has now largely disappeared from memory and from history. For me as an author, as a historian, it is important to keep the ambivalence created by the impossibility of distinguishing both between what is fact and what is fiction. What I've written is meant to challenge both genres and my readers. Even if that past can only be reconstructed by imaginary characters within a historical framework, it does not mean that the narrative of this retelling is less true than an erratic documentary record that gives no voice to the many victims of this era. For as I've tried to show today, ultimately, there is no single historical truth. Thank you.